Welcome to the Wits About Us podcast, episode 2, where we interview Australian tradeswoman Louise Azzopardi and discover how her unwavering determination and commitment to staying in the game led to her success at the World Skills Competition. Okay, let's get into episode 2. Okay, so welcome to episode 2 of Wits About Us, where we discuss how women can address challenges and barriers to thrive in a trade-based career. Louise, I'd love to jump into your story as a tradeswoman. To get started, I'm going to ask you, what were you doing before you decided to enter a trade-based career?
Yeah, so before I decided to enter into a trades-based career, I was literally looking for any way out of school. So I grew up on a farm where we grow tomatoes. So my family grows tomatoes. And I was always working with my hand, working with my dad, like fixing machinery, picking and packing vegetables. And what I was learning at school, I was like, I couldn't connect it to like the quote unquote real world that I knew of my parents' business and working. And I was like, this is not for me. I couldn't sit still. I didn't like learning about things that I wasn't interested in. And I actually tried to leave school in year 7. I was like, Dad, just come and let me work on the farm. Like, I know what to do. I can read and write. What else do I need to know? Kind of thing. And Dad's like, you need to stay till at least year 10 and then you can leave, do something else. And then if you want to come back to the farm, you can afterwards. So when I was in year 10, I was like, okay, I need to decide what I am going to do after school. So I decided to go into mechanics. I also rode and raced dirt bikes as well, and we used to fix all the bikes at home and do all our own work. So first I was like, okay, I want to be a motorcycle mechanic. So I went and did work experience at our local bike shop where we used to get our parts from. So they knew who I was and all that kind of thing. So there was no barriers for me being a female because they had known me for about 10 or so years as I come in and out with my dad. So let me do work experience there and I loved it, but they had taken on an apprentice the year before, so they didn't have a spot for me. So then I went to the next bike shop who was like, we got parts from sometimes, but they weren't our main shop. So they also knew me, but same thing, they had just taken on an apprentice as well. But I was stacking up things to put on my resume. So all these businesses, all these referrals. And then towards the end of year 10, I went to the Penrith Apprenticeship Expo, where I had 3 conversations that really changed my life. The first conversation was really like short and sharp. We went up to the stand, like my parents were with me. I was 15 at the time, so I couldn't drive. So my parents were with me. My dad come up with me to this stand and they were like, we wouldn't want our daughters working here. We wouldn't suggest it for you. And I later found out that a male apprentice had been sexually harassed at that workshop as well. So got out of that one, but unfortunately, like, it's sad to hear that workshops are like that still. Then the second conversation we had was a bit more of a lecture. So me and my dad went up to this stand, the next one, and this guy lectured me for like 10 minutes about how I couldn't be a mechanic, how I was too small to do the work, how I, at the time it was still motorcycle mechanics that I was after. And he's like, if you can't push the big bikes around, and I don't think you can, then you won't be able to work on them. And I was like so deflated after this and like, head down, kind of like, Mom, Dad, can we go home now? But Mum and Dad were like, no, this is what you want. Like, let's keep going. Like, we're here now. Let's just keep looking around. And thank God they did push me to keep looking around, because that's when I met Sarah. So Sarah at the time was a first year heavy vehicle mechanic. She was like the same height as me and the same build as me. At the time we were both blonde, but it's changed a few times since then. But I could really see myself in her, like, if she can do it, then why can't I? And she encouraged me to do work experience at her work, and I did. I loved it. I applied for the job and I got the job, and I really haven't looked back since.
Wow, that's an incredible story, and well done on your parents for encouraging you to keep going even though you felt deflated. I can see the real changing point for you was seeing someone exactly like you who was doing the trade. How important was that conversation for you in terms of determining the rest of your career?
Yeah, so I think like right at the beginning when I started looking at getting into a trade, there wasn't anything deterring me. I didn't have any bad experiences behind me yet. And even when I was doing work experience and they were like, you're great, but we just don't have a position for you. It wasn't like, we don't want to take you on kind of thing. So I still hadn't reached that point where I thought there was, like, I thought I couldn't do it. So I was still like, yep. And then when I had went to that expo and had those conversations and really like had been told like to my face over and over again, like this guy kept repeating himself. He's like, you can't do it. You're too small, blah, blah, blah. You should look at something else. And like from that, that's when like that deflation really started. That was like, well, maybe I can't do it. Like, you know, and from that, then seeing Sarah, like just having those two conversations like 10 minutes apart and going from that, like, okay, can we just go home? Like, I'll just do year 11 and 12 and you know what, maybe this isn't for me, to like, no, look, here is the evidence. Like they're willing to take me on for work experience. They like, look, Sarah is doing it. There's no reason why I can't. Like this guy's just not the right person to be talking to. Like Sarah obviously has the answers and she's doing it.
Exactly. And you've just highlighted the example of a myth versus the evidence. So a myth versus the truth. Okay, so you've done the work experience, you've got the job. What was the first day like on the job?
Oh, the first day is actually it's not the most convenient kind of first day I had. So we did our 2 weeks apprentice onboarding. So we were working for a fairly large company, an international company. So we had our onboarding where everyone on the East Coast, so Queensland, New South Wales, and Victorian apprentices all come together. And, you know, I was the only girl in that onboarding and there was 30 of us. And I think Sarah had been the first female apprentice that they had taken on nationwide and I was the second. And this was in 2012. So the onboarding was great. Like I was fairly young, so I was 15 at the time. And, you know, just getting, you know, used to the adult world and, you know, all of these, like I was used to being around like lots of like men and boys. Like I rode and raced dirt bikes and I was, you know, did woodwork in high school. So that wasn't new to me. It was more like, wow, now I'm an adult kind of thing. But then when I actually started, you know, working in the workshop, I actually was sick for the first 2 days. I had gotten pneumonia, so I couldn't work for the first few days. And then I went into work after that. And it was kind of like, now looking back on it and what I tell other apprentices is like the first 6 months of an apprenticeship is like being dunked by a wave in the beach. You've got all this stuff getting chucked at you. You're learning to be an adult. And like for me, like I don't think I can clearly remember anything from my first 6 months. It was kind of just a blur of new information. And then like, you know, 6 months in, I kind of started to remember more things, but there was just so much new information coming at me, so many new people. And yeah, it like all felt amazing, but I can't remember anything in particular.
Such a great description of entering into the world of work. You're becoming an adult, although you're only 15. And as you describe, that first 6 months was a blur. How did you manage that? Looking back, how did you manage all of the learning and, you know, get through that first 6 months?
I think it's really just being in that learning state of mind and like not using your energy to beat yourself up because you don't know. Like, you know, we all know people who think they know everything and usually they don't know too much. So it's just being like, okay, it's perfectly okay that I don't know this. It's, you know, like in the beginning, like you're still learning the names of tools and, you know, the names of people and the names of the machines. And, you know, you're still kind of like, oh my God, that's such like, for me, because I was working on trucks, I'm like, oh, that's such an awesome truck. And like, you still wouldn't remember the brands and all that kind of stuff now. And now like you remember, like you can see a truck and you know what engine's in it and you know what kind of gearbox setup's in it just by looking at it. But before you're like, oh my God, it's a truck, like, you know, and you're trying to take on all this information. And now I've like watched it from the outside with, we'll get to it later, but I've got one of my coaching clients. I started working with her from the very beginning. So like her first week, and now she's 6 months in, and watching from the outside, watching her go through that process. Like at the beginning, I'd be like, oh, what did you do this week? And she's like, we worked on a machine. And I was like, yep, that's fine. And now she's like, yeah, we worked on this, recycling machine and it does this, and we worked on this specific component. So it's just like you go from being amazed by everything and then you start learning the names and what everything is.
And you've just described a really key learning to learn principle, which I learned in my career, which is be kind to yourself while you learn. So great advice for new people entering a trade. As you progressed through your apprenticeship, do you remember that first thrill or that first achievement that you got?
Yeah, so I remember my first full engine rebuild that I did on my own. So as a mechanic, like we often do like a full engine rebuild on a heavy vehicle engine, so like a 15-litre engine kind of thing, takes up to a week kind of thing. So it's a 5-day process, and going in and out, as an apprentice, you pass around on different jobs. So through my first 2 years, I had done most components of an engine rebuild with someone, whether it be like one day on one person's truck helping someone else and then another day helping another mechanic doing another part of it. So I had kind of all the pieces of the puzzle, and this truck come in and my supervisor come up to me and he's like, oh yeah, Louise, like I think you're ready. And I was like, what do you mean? And the truck had it had a fault that 99% of the time ended up in an engine rebuild. So it was right at the beginning of the process, and he's like, I'm going to give you this truck. We've got extra time on it, so take your time, don't stress, but, I think you're ready. So we did it, and, I remember doing, I diagnosed it, said, okay, this is why I think we need to do the engine rebuild, and then we got approval, so then I started pulling it all down, dismantling the whole engine, cleaning all the parts, doing the parts list, so seeing what was faulty, what needed to be replaced, and then starting to put everything back together and just thinking there's all the technical aspects of it that I then picked up. But one part that I really remember was tensioning the cylinder head bolts, and there's 26 of them, and they go to 300 foot-pound plus a 90-degree torque turn. So the bar or the tension wrench that we use to tension 300 foot-pound is about as tall as I am. And fully grown men often struggle to do that kind of task. And I worked with a lot of bodybuilders in that workshop, and they were kind of the only ones who could do it easily, even though they still struggled. So then there was little old me, and I was like, I'm going to do this all on my own. And for safety, it is a 2-person task. Someone holds on to the top of the tension wrench while the other person is using their whole body weight and all their might to tighten these bolts. So I was doing the tightening, and one of my coworkers was holding the head of the tension wrench for me. And we got about halfway, and he's like, we can swap if you want. And I'm like, no, I just need a minute. I'm going to do this all on my own. So we went through, and I did it all on my own, and it was such a good feeling. And then, we get to starting the truck, and it's funny, one of those things, if you're a hobby mechanic at home, then, the machine doesn't need to start at the end. If you make a mistake, then that's, whatever, we'll work on it again next week. But this is okay, it needs to start because it's a customer's truck. They're waiting for it. So, step in, sitting in the driver's seat, turn the key. We have a bit of a process to get all the oil pressures and everything built up again. And I remember sitting there and starting it, and it started, and I was like, oh my God, this is just such an amazing feeling, going from, we were just talking about starting and not even remembering the names of trucks to rebuilding a whole engine on my own in 2 years. That was an insane experience. And I need to move it from my parents' house, but I have a piston that I took out of that engine rebuild that I have on my display case back at my parents'. So it's just one of those things that it's I can do anything. I learned from, not knowing the names of tools, not knowing the names of trucks, to being able to rebuild a whole engine on my own.
I absolutely love that. You just learned that you can do anything. And I also loved that you gave yourself the time to be successful. I remember reading a book, and it said, if you give yourself the time, you can complete any task. So congratulations. What an amazing achievement. Now, we know that an apprenticeship is made up of on-the-job learning as well as structured and formal study. Tell me a little bit about how your learning and your study helped you in your apprenticeship.
Yeah, so like I said before, I wasn't really one for school and sitting down in classroom, but for some reason when it come to learning about trucks and engines and that, I was like totally in the books. Like I was like the quote unquote nerdy kid of the class. I was like, give me all of the information about trucks. I just loved it. But I remember the first time I walked into TAFE, and this was in 2012, and I was like wearing my like fresh work shirt and my fresh work pants, and I could hear like the class, like the boys in the class like talking and laughing. And I remember just walking into the class and everyone just went silent and they were all just staring at me. And you could start to imagine what they were thinking by like the looks on their faces. And I was thinking like, did your parents teach you how to shower regularly? Like it was Monday morning and they were still all grubby and I was like, what is going on here? But I found my seat and, a few minutes later, the teacher walks in and he's like, starts marking names off the list. So he's like, Michael, Adrian, Luke, Curtis. And then he pauses and does like this double take. And he's like, Lois. And I was like, raise my hand quietly. And I'm like, it's Louise, sir. And so it was kind of like, oh, there's a girl's name on here. It can't be kind of true, that unconscious bias. But I ended up having a really, really good relationship with my TAFE teachers and my TAFE peers. I learnt so much, and where I was working was an engine manufacturing company. So we predominantly worked on engines. So TAFE was such a great experience TAFE or technical college was such a great experience to learn different aspects of the truck, to learn about different brands, to work with different apprentices that were at the same level as me. And like hearing about all their different experiences and what their workplace was like. Like everyone had such a different experience, even though we're all technically first year apprentices, everyone was having such a different journey.
Yeah, so that's really interesting, isn't it? Because you're learning on the job from your peers and colleagues, but TAFE provided you a cohort-based learning experience with people from different industries or different workshops where you could learn from as well. Let's talk about that a little bit more. You mentioned you were 2 of 30 apprentices at your company. What was that like and how did you navigate it?
Yeah, so with that, like so across the Eastern Coast, I was the only girl in that first year lot, but at the particular workplace where we went every day, me and Sarah were the only girls in a workshop of about 40. And there was about 5 apprentices in each year. So there was about 20 apprentices in total there. And it was very interesting to navigate. Like Sarah was a few years older than me when she started. I think she was still about 19 when she started. So a little bit more mature than I was. So I was 15 when I started. But I was, in there as a 15-year-old girl with these boys that were, 16, 17 as well. And you know what? I did, it wasn't the smoothest sailing in that process. Mostly, technically I was doing really well. I loved the work. I was picking up the skills really easily. But on that social side of things, I really did struggle because, now looking back at it, I would have been in year 11 and 12 learning how to socialize, in a mixed cohort of guys and girls. But I really was just with mostly guys. And, most men, when they all get together, and especially in that workshop environment, they talk about women in a pretty derogatory way. Talking about their body and that kind of thing. And so I ended up having a relationship with one of my first year peers. He was a first year apprentice at the same workplace. And he had told me to keep it a secret so it didn't interfere at work. And I did, and, the relationship ended. And I then found out that he actually had a girlfriend the whole time. That's why he really wanted to keep it quiet. So there was me going through that kind of, oh shit, this guy, like, so that's me going through that. And then a few years later, he left the workplace and I started hearing all these rumors, like, you know, people were saying, oh, like so-and-so said you hooked up with him, blah, blah, blah. And one of the other girls, so at this time, another female mechanic started working with us. And she asked me, she's like, oh, Louise, like so-and-so saying that, you know, he went around saying everyone that he like got you and like kind of in a derogatory way. And, you know, hearing that, I was distraught. I beat myself up so much. I was like, I'm part of the reason why some people think women only get into the trades to get with guys. And then I was in this situation where I was tensioning a fan belt on a truck and it was an old style one, so I needed to use a bar to do the tensioning. And I bumped myself in the head quite hard. And I went to my supervisor, I said, you know, I bumped myself in the head. And he was like, oh, let me know if you feel dizzy or, you know, your memory starts going in case you get like you've got a concussion or something. And then I went back about half an hour later and I was like, I can't think, I can't concentrate. And he's like, I don't think it's the bump on your head that's causing you not to concentrate. So I went in and he went in and put me in the first aid room and he got the admin manager to come and talk to me. So like another woman to come and talk to me and she's like, are you okay? And I just broke down. Like I was not okay. I was struggling so much. And, you know, she ended up, you know, taking me to speak to HR about it. And then the investigation started, the HR investigation started. And at that point in time, I didn't think it could get any worse, but it did. Because through the investigation, people were getting investigated, like my coworkers were getting investigated because this stuff was happening out in public. So it was like, oh, did you see this happening? Did you hear this? And they all stopped talking to me because they thought I was trying to get them all fired through this process. So I was, you know, I had my friendship breakdown. I had been getting bullied. And then like my peers just didn't want to talk to me at all. And I was quite isolated. And by this time, it was the 4th year of my apprenticeship. And, you know, come out of the other end of that, things started to get a little bit better after that. But it was still something that, like, honestly, so that was, the 4th year of my apprenticeship was 2015. And, like, some of that kind of hurt and pain, like, still lingers from then.
How did you get through it? What was the outcome?
Really, so I ended up getting a final written warning from the ethics investigation from what had happened in first year with one of my apprentice peers. But really, I started seeing a counsellor. The admin manager was my support person through the process, and I ended up like having lunch with her every week and, you know, just talking through how I was doing. And really, I had some really good male mentors in my life who, even though I didn't speak to them about the process and they didn't quite understand what was going on, they believed in me as a mechanic and they were like, we're going to like help you as much as we can through this. And I had some really good friends as well who supported me through it. And, you know, in the end, so a bit later on from that, I ended up moving workplaces and like starting fresh kind of thing and shaking that off bit by bit.
Wonderful. And for those listening to the podcast today, here at MIGAS, we have vacancies for apprentices and you can apply and you're placed with a host employer. And throughout that process, we assign you with a field officer, which is your support person that you have from the very beginning. Louise, it's wonderful that you were able to seek out that admin person and have those male mentors in your life. But I just thought it was important to point out that going through MIGAS, you'd have that set up from the beginning and you would have that support and that's someone that you could talk to from the very beginning, which sounds like it's really important in the journey of an apprentice. And the other thing too is your mental health. It sounds like you were able to seek support and then this was sort of back, it started in 2012. So it's great that you knew where to go to access that support. So you've dusted yourself off, you've overcome a very big challenge, no doubt had a lot of learning along the way. You've finished your apprenticeship, fantastic. What happens now in your story?
Yeah, so there's a few little overlapping kind of stories that happen. So during this time, so in my 4th year of my apprenticeship, while this investigation had been going on, my mentor actually put me forward to compete in the World Skills competition. So the World Skills competition, it's like the Olympics for tradies. It's run in about 60 different categories, from like hairdressing, boiler making, carpentry, and mechanics. So I competed in the heavy vehicle competition in 2015 in the regionals, and I had about a week's notice for the competition, and my goal was like not to come last. And in my head as well, I had been, in the midst of this ethics investigation, and people weren't talking to me at work. And I was like, look, I can just step out of this workplace. Nobody knows me at this competition. We had gone to a more regional TAFE to do the competition, so nobody knew me. And I was like, yeah, this is fresh slate. I can be whoever I want here. So I went in with the goal not to come last, and I ended up succeeding. I come second in that competition, which was an amazing feeling. And second place doesn't automatically go to national competition. The first place automatically goes through. So I didn't get that automatic pathway. But I had a few people who were like, yeah, you know what, like some places aren't running competitions, so there's some places at nationals for, second place people to go kind of thing. And I was like, yeah, cool, like I'd really love to do that. And then in 2016, at the beginning, I found out that I was accepted to compete in the national competition. So I was like, you know what, none of this coming second anymore. Like I'm in it to win it. So I completed 2 skill sets. So at the time, TAFE was offering these free skill sets. And I did one in auto electrical and one in mobile plant to really expand my skills and my knowledge. And about 6 months through 2016, I mostly settled down at work. I was still working at the same workplace, but then I started having issues with one of the supervisors. And he was a bit of a bully, but he would kind of pick people and like chip at them until they left. And then it happened to be my turn in the process. And he was a night shift supervisor at the time, and I stopped doing overtime. I was always one to work till 6. Like we usually finished at 4, but I would usually do 2 hours of overtime every night just to finish off my truck or get some extra cash. I really enjoyed it. But he would come around in the afternoon and like just stand next to you and expect you to tell him where you're up to with your truck and not be like, hey, where are you up to? That kind of human decency kind of conversation. And I was like, oh, like this doesn't feel good anymore. I'm not going to, like, I don't need to do the overtime money-wise, so I'm not going to do it. And then he ended up becoming my like full-time supervisor. He moved to day shift and he was my full-time supervisor. And I ended up like trying to talk to him about it. I had a conversation with him. I said, when you don't look me in the eye, you don't say, hey, what are you up to? You just kind of stand there and expect me to tell you what I'm up to. Like, it doesn't feel good. I don't want to come up to you and talk about my job, like where I'm up to with it. Like, I don't feel comfortable with it. And he was like, oh yeah, okay, like what would you like me to do? I'm like, oh yeah, I'd like you to say, when you want an update on my job, just be like, hey Louise, what are you up to? And in my mind, I'm like, it's like 6 words. It's not really that much to ask. And he needs the answer to the question anyway. So he did it for like a few days, and then he went back to the old way again. And I was like, no, I'm not feeling this. And I really started to dislike being a mechanic. I was like, look, and I had gone through all that journey through the relationships and that kind of thing. So I was like, maybe this really isn't for me. Like, I'm not having a good time here anymore. But I had gotten a part-time job as part of my training for National World Skills because I was like, I want to get as much experience as I can. And the workplace only worked on engines. So I was like, let's go and work at a place. So I was working Saturdays at a place that worked on all machines, all parts of the machines. And I was really enjoying it. And I was sitting with a friend at like Sunday lunch one day, and I was like, oh, I think I'm going to leave and like do engineering at uni or something. And she's like, oh, why would you do that? I was like, I'm just really not liking being a mechanic anymore. And she's like, you really like that job you do on Saturdays. Isn't that still being a mechanic? And I was like, yeah, it is. And she's like, why don't you just work there full time? And I was like, it's so obvious, but I did not see it. So I ended up, going to my boss that I was working for part time, And it was like, he was like, oh, how was work this week, Louise? And I was like, actually, it's been awful. Do you have a full-time job for me? And it was a family business. So it was like him, his wife, and there was an apprentice working with them. So he went and spoke to his wife. And a few weeks later, I started working there full-time, which was one of the best decisions I ever made. And about a month after that is when I competed in the National World Skills competition. And like having this, like my boss, he had competed in the competition in the 80s, I think it was. And he was like giving me as much help and support as he could, like building my confidence back up. Went in, competed in the competition. And I was the first female to compete in the heavy vehicle competition Australia-wide. Like for the national competition. And then I was the first female to win the competition. So it was such an amazing experience. And it was really overwhelming for me because I had been living in this kind of, you know, having all this kind of social stuff happening that wasn't too great, but then also technically doing really well. So in my mind, it was a bit muddled up and I was like, shit, I've won this competition. Like this is... And I remember for about a week afterwards, every time someone would say, oh, congratulations, I would just like burst into tears. It was just so much emotion. But it was really like quite a surreal but amazing experience.
Congratulations. What a phenomenal experience, and the first woman ever to win that competition in Australia and to compete in Australia. It's really interesting because it points out that you were absolutely technically competent. You were the best in Australia at being a heavy vehicle mechanic. But when you were working in your first place of employment, you kept telling yourself that people had a perception of you. How important is that self-talk in navigating an apprenticeship, would you say, like for someone starting out now, for example?
Yeah, so the self-talk is so important. I actually run a workshop on it, like just to really give people the tools. But the way that you talk to yourself makes all the difference. People, and the confidence really comes from within. Like if you're waiting for other people to tell you that you're good at something, then it's really hit and miss because people's interpretation of what is good and what isn't good is so varied. And then the way that you interpret what is good is probably the most important thing because you got to live with yourself like over and over again in your own head. Like that's who you're talking to the most. So that self-talk, breaking it down and being like, okay, what am I telling myself that is true? What am I telling myself that isn't true? What are the facts behind what is going on? So like anxiety is anxiety in moderation is pretty normal for everyone. It becomes a problem when it takes over and stops you from doing things. So often we have really anxious thoughts and we try to just pretend they're not there. But so often our like thoughts and our feelings, like if we try and pretend they're not there and be like, no, go away. It's kind of like a toddler when you tell them that they can't have something and then they want it even more. But when you listen to them and give them what they want, then they kind of get bored of it really quickly and then it goes away. So often like with our anxious thoughts, if we sit there and be like, okay, what are we saying? Are we saying that we need to double check something? Are we saying that we need to prepare a little bit more for something? Are we saying that, maybe, this doesn't feel right? And actually like listening to it and being like, okay, is there something logically that I can do here? Should I study for this test another hour because I haven't studied at all? Or yes, I have studied for, 4 or 5 hours this week and actually I need to sleep and that's what's going to help me prepare for the test. So just listening to them and looking at them logically and being like, okay, this is true, this is not true, and this is something I can do and adjust my behavior about and really go from there. So then you're not battling in your own mind as much.
And that's probably a good segue to talk about how you've now become a coach of young females and you're essentially mentoring them to be successful in the industry. Tell me a little bit about that role and the types of clients that you work with.
Yeah, so I started my own business coaching and mentoring tradeswomen and tradies in 2013. It's 2021. I'm like doing the maths on how many years it's been. But yeah, it's been about 2.5 years. And it's been such an amazing role. So I pretty much created it from what I wish I had. like in those moments when I felt like, you know, everyone would judge me, no one would want to hear about my problems because they dismiss me, they tell me it's not a big deal. And, you know, in some instances, some people did tell me it wasn't a big deal, or say, some people were saying, oh no, you're screwed, like no one's going to respect you, kind of thing. And just being able to sit and listen and offer practical solutions for these kind of things that, you know, typically aren't talked about mainstream. Like workplace relationships is something that happens, but the tools you need to either move on or navigate them aren't really spoken about. And I've had, you know, since sharing that story, I've had a few girls come up to me and be like, well, I dated this guy twice and now he's being a bully to me at work, but I don't want to report him to HR or talk to him about it because it's my fault for going out with him. And it's like, well, just because you dated someone and then stopped dating them doesn't mean they have every right to bully you every day at work. Like, the two aren't mutually exclusive. And giving them the tools and, you know, a listening ear for that kind of stuff as well. And then going through the confidence side of things, building up the confidence in the trade. Like, you know, as an apprentice, you're employed because you don't know much and you're learning. And just navigating that and navigating any sexism or unconscious bias that comes up. So if someone's being sexist to you, what do you do? Like, how can you break that down? How can you have a conversation that creates change? How do you stop that person's comments from getting into your confidence and affecting your self-worth and how you think about yourself as a tradie just due to someone else's, one or two people's opinions, where everyone else has a really great view or opinion on you?
So what would you say to someone who is trying to have that courageous conversation? How do they go about that?
Yeah, so I break it down into like a 3-step process. So we want to work out the exact behavior that is bothering you. It's kind of like giving feedback to someone. You need the feedback to be specific so then they can change it. So even though if someone's doing a multitude of things that are really bothering you, chip at them one at a time, because when you give someone feedback, if you give it too much and they get overwhelming and nothing changes. So say, for example, I had that conversation with the supervisor that was bothering me at the previous workplace. And, you know, the particular thing that was really bothering me was the fact that he wasn't looking me in the eyes and was expecting me to ask a question that he didn't physically ask. So breaking that down to a conversation that I would have with him, I'd start off with, last week when you stood next to me and expected me to tell you what was going on, that really bothered me because it felt like you didn't respect me. So the behavior, why it bothered you, and then what you'd like them to do differently. So same as giving feedback, what are they doing? What would you like it to happen? So, you know, going back to that, hey, last week when you didn't actually look me in the eye and talk to me about what was going on, it made me feel really undervalued and uncomfortable. I would rather if you come and say, hey, Louise, can you tell me what you're up to on this job? I'd really appreciate that and make me feel more included, and I don't mind telling you what's going on. So you want to tell them what the behavior is, why it's bothering you, and what you'd like them to do differently. And, you know, scripting that is pretty easy, and then you have to go up to actually telling the person. And it's so funny because the guy that I had this conversation with, he was a bodybuilder and he was like built like a cloud, and he was like 6 foot tall, and I'm here like little, I don't even know how many feet I am, but I'm like 160 centimeters tall. And having that conversation with him was something that I rehearsed in the mirror, that I had notes for, that I read before I said, hey, can I talk to you? And that's totally okay. You can, you know, practice it in the mirror. You can do it off the cuff if you want to. You can have your notes with you if you want to make sure you get that conversation out really clearly.
Excellent. And that's a really great framework for having a difficult conversation, whether it's with another female or a male in the workforce. So that's really great that you're scaffolding that and helping people who you are coaching. What are some success stories that you're hearing from your coachees? It's been about a decade since you've started your trade. What's going on in the industry now?
Yeah, it's starting to shift. It's sad, but some of the problems are still the same, but there's more support and more community out there, especially with social media. Like, a lot of us still are the only girl on the work site. But we are connected with hundreds of other women all over the world, all over the country through social media. So the community is there a lot more. So I've been finding like there's a lot less imposter syndrome because it's easy to see other women in the workplace through the tools of social media. Another thing is like that kind of full circle kind of moment. I actually caught up with one of the girls last week who was 4 years ago struggling to get an apprenticeship, like really trying in. And now she's qualified and she literally just walked into a place and she starts working the next day. And if they start to piss her off or bother her, then she's like, okay, I don't deserve this. And then she can go into another place and start working pretty much straight away. And it's such a difference to at the beginning when she was really trying to get in that door and like get a start on her apprenticeship to be like, actually, you know, if you treat me badly, I'll just leave because I'll be able to get another job. So
right.
being able to see that.
Great. So you don't need to put up with that behaviour in the workplace. It's just simply a matter of giving the feedback. If things don't change, walking out the door and finding that next position, would you say?
Yeah, pretty much. And when I talk more about sexism, like one of the biggest things of that is knowing when enough is enough. So you can have as many conversations as you can. You can change your self-talk as much as you want. But if someone is treating you like crap every day and you've tried to change it, then, you know, there are other places that will take you. And I remember, you know, shifting from my first job into my second job as a mechanic and having that thought like, oh, like, no, I'm lucky to have this job as a woman. No one else is ever going to take me on. And then once I went out there into the world and, you know, asked for another job, like it wasn't that difficult. A lot of it was like, quote unquote, in my head. But some people had told me that. Some people had said, oh, you're really lucky to have that job as a girl. So it wasn't all in my head. Some people had told me that, but it's not true. It's, you know, you're a person who is employed, and especially like as a first year, it might be a bit more difficult. But once you get those skills behind you, especially with the skills shortage, everyone's like, you know, you're a second year, you can do A, B, and C. Yep, cool. You've got a job, like male or female. And, you know, if they do reject you for a female because you're a female, that's glad that door's closed.
A good sign. You don't want to work there.
Yeah, no, like, yeah, cool. You stay over there. I'll get a job somewhere else.
Okay, and so that's where we're at now. Do you have a vision for the future for tradeswomen? What do you want it to look like?
Really, I want there to be like no conversation about being a tradeswoman, that it's just normal, that this is just, oh yeah, it's a job option. It's like someone saying that, you know, they want to, I don't know, what's a gender neutral job? Like just being normal, like just it's not a big deal. It's not like, oh my God, you want to be a mechanic? Isn't that going to be hard? And like, even I remember when I became a trainer and assessor, because I spent a few years as a trainer and assessor as well before I went into coaching. Like someone had told me, they're like, oh, being a trainer and assessor for mechanics as a female was going to be hard. And I'm like, I've been in this for 7 years. I know, I know the challenges that it comes across. But it's just kind of like, there shouldn't be a conversation about it. It's just you're getting a job. The boys, and even with that, like going into what the men experience and the boys experience, like construction does have the highest suicide rate. And there's a reason for that. Like some of the situations that women are in and women are speaking about, they're not good for the guys either. And that's something like as a whole shift, like as a whole industry, it's shifting in the right direction, not just for women, but for the guys as well.
Yes, I would agree. Mental health and how to respond to mental health is absolutely more at the forefront now than it ever has been. And just a note for our listeners, my training, which is a fully owned subsidiary of MIGAS, we offer mental health first aid training. So therefore you can understand about the different mental health challenges and importantly, know how to respond to someone who is suffering from a mental health issue and to get them connected to support as quickly as possible. And my training now has courses available across Australia as well as an online course. So I think it's more important that people start to invest in mental health knowledge so that we can all support each other in the workplace and just to recognise the signs of someone who is struggling in this area and to be able to reach out to them. Would you agree, Louise?
Yeah, definitely. And like looking back at when I was in that situation where I was talking to myself so badly in my first workplace, like I had a lot of physical signs that something was mentally not okay. Like from going to someone who starts work 2 hours early to someone who's lucky to get there on time, like not wanting to talk to anyone, not being overly interested or having pride in my work, wanting to leave like right on the buzzer when, you know, I used to always do 2 hours overtime. Like there's little physical signs that, you know, changes of behavior that do indicate someone's struggling mentally, like, or socially or any kind of thing, like pretty much any invisible kind of struggle. There generally are physical signs that people can pick up on.
Yeah, absolutely. You have just pointed out a list of signs that training says that we need to look out for people in the workplace, which highlights the importance of having that training for supervisors and colleagues so people can really rally around each other and support one another. I'm really curious now as we start to draw towards the end of the podcast. You were 15 years old when you started your apprenticeship. You're now a coach. You've been highly successful in your career. I have a couple of questions to close us out today, but the first one is, how did you remain connected to your love and passion of your trade throughout the experience?
Really, it's like going back to like why I started. And like I remember like originally I was looking for a motorcycle mechanic, but when I did that week's work experience on trucks, I was like, this is it. This is my life. I never want to stop like working around trucks. And when I was going through those hard times, you know, when I was, you know, crying in my favorite cry spot or crying on the way home and thinking like, I want to give it all up, I'd be like, what else would I want to do? Like, no, I want to be a mechanic. Like the work has not hurt me. It's the people. And then really just thinking of that, like, I really love working on trucks. So what's a different way that I can do it? What is a way that I can help manage these things that are going on so I can continue doing what I love?
Exactly. And do you talk to your coaching clients about resilience and how they can sort of stay in the workforce or navigate those challenges? Is resilience a really topic of conversation?
Yeah, I think like I don't really label it as resilience, but having those conversations like, okay, so you're thinking and worrying about all these other things. Why do you go to work every day? Let's strip it back to the bones. Like, rather than, because like we put all this, it's almost like quote unquote social fluff, but it does have a big impact on us. But once we strip that away, do you enjoy your work? Do you enjoy the work? Do you, enjoy the lifestyle that it creates and all that kind of thing? And it's like, okay, then let's start adding things back on. What is necessary to care about in this situation? What actually is enjoyable to care about, and coming back from that?
That's right. So keeping them with that real zero focus on what they love about their job. The very last question I've got for you is around the advice that you would give a young woman who is just about to enter an apprenticeship, imagining yourself at 15 walking in those doors and starting out. There's many women across the country who are going to be inspired and encouraged to participate in a trade-based career. This is what this podcast is all about. What would you tell them?
Yeah, really, like if they love it, don't let anything get in your way of doing it. And just like, same thing, stripping it back, like why are you doing it? Because you love the work? Okay, there's plenty of different workplaces that will take you on. So if one workplace says no, then go to the next one. Then go to the next one. And that's okay. Like I've got friends who, had to apply to 60 different jobs, who shorten their name so it's gender neutral on their resume kind of thing. And going through that, like remembering why you started. And then even in the process of getting the job, I actually wrote a little ebook about this, but really like when you go to apply for a job, wear clothes that you can picture yourself walking straight into the workplace and working. So, for me as a mechanic, I wear long sleeve shirt, hair tied back, work boots, work pants kind of thing. And, I don't know if this is sexist in the opposite way, but, sometimes men don't have the greatest imagination and they need to have some hints and tips on how to picture you in their workplace. So if you're fully dressed like you could work into the workplace, then they'll look at you and be like, oh yeah, I can see you working, out there with the boys. And then it like kind of breaks down one of those unconscious barriers to getting into the industry.
And any other final tips that you've got, Louise, that we haven't discussed today that you would like our audience to hear that you haven't covered?
Work experience. If people tell you they're like, oh, you don't have the skills to start an apprenticeship, which for one is bullshit because you're starting an apprenticeship and you're learning from square one. But, sometimes they want you to have a bit of basic hand tools and that kind of thing. So if you do a week of work experience, so free work placement, you pick up that. You pick up the workshop awareness, you pick up the language, you start to pick up the basic tool use, which then, quote unquote, makes you the right applicant to then go and apply for those jobs again.
And there's absolutely pre-apprenticeship programs out there as well that you can participate in. Louise, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today and hearing all about your journey. I'm sure there's lots of women who are going to benefit from this podcast today. I just want to thank you and wish you all the best for your future.
Thank you. It's been great being on.
This project is funded by the Trade Pathways Program, Trading Services New South Wales, and produced in partnership with MIGAS Apprentices and Trainees. Now, if you're on the lookout for an apprenticeship opportunity, we've got a valuable resource for you. In the show notes, you'll find a link to MIGAS where you can connect with them directly. They've been instrumental in helping thousands of tradies get qualified.